Hi, everyone. Nice to see everyone for this lecture series. And I would like to first of all acknowledge that we are gathered today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Masculine people. And I'd like to say a few words about the Mobilities Group as well as the UBC Centre for Migration. Our group, which I'm helping to lead and organize activities for, aims to produce a new line of inquiry within mobility analysis at UBC. This is a line of inquiry that's more humanistic, interpretive, multilingual, culturally sensitive, scholarship on the multiple and intersecting mobilities. And in the past year, we have invited lecturers from all over the world to speak with us in a multidisciplinary way. For example, we had speakers from sociology, geography, history, cinema studies, and literature. And yeah, so with this lecture series, we also hope to broaden the disciplines and perspectives involving mobility analysis and migration analysis within our group. So our group is under the auspices of UBC Centre for Migration Studies. And the center aims to bring together researchers from a wide range of disciplines, and in order to understand and engage in debate about the drivers and consequences of international migration through research, education, and outreach. And please follow UBC Migration on Twitter, and our Twitter handle is on the slide that which you're seeing on this lecture remote screen. I'd like to acknowledge and thank our co-sponsor, which is the UBC Department of Anthropology. I'd also like to thank the team that has been working behind the scenes, Douglas Ober, Dustin Gray, Emily Amber Gay, and Atiye Yetda, for their help and assistance for setting up the Zoom meeting, as well as other logistical issues. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Susanne Wessendorf. She is a professor of social anthropology at Coventry University's Center for Trust, Peace, and Social Relations. She has been doing research on migration, transnationalism, and migrant settlement for more than 10 years. Her recent work focuses on understanding new forms of social inclusion and exclusion in contexts of immigration-related diversity. Since completing her Doctor of Philosophy at the Center on Migration, Policy, and Society at the University of Oxford, she has been a postdoctoral research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity, Marie Curie Research Fellow at the Institute for Research into Superdiversity at the University of Birmingham, and Associate Professorial Research Fellow at the London School of Economics International Inequalities Institute. So I'm sure that the UBC intellectual community is very pleased to have Dr. Wessendorf deliver her talk today, which is entitled Social Exclusion, Symbolic Boundaries, and Convivial Labor in East London's Context of Ongoing Immigration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gov, for your kind introduction, and thank you also for inviting me to give this lecture so far away, but from my office at home. Isn't it wonderful? There's some good things that resulted from this pandemic. Not many, but a few good things. So today I want to talk about an ongoing research project which I'm currently undertaking in Newham in East London in the UK. And the project looks at the overlayering of old and new immigration. And with this, I refer to areas where you have had large-scale post-war immigration and where there are now established ethnic minorities. And since then, and especially more recently, there has been ongoing immigration from various parts of the world. So in Newham, in East London, you have large numbers of people of mainly South Asian, but also Caribbean and African backgrounds, and they have been there for up to 3 generations. And this is coupled with the immigration of newcomers from many different places. Recently, immigration from Eastern Europe has been the most noticeable, but there are also newcomers from Latin America, other parts of Europe and Africa. Now, most I apologize. Most studies on attitudes towards newcomers in Europe focus on the white majority population. And there has been a lot of work done on how especially people in more disadvantaged areas, also described as left behind areas in the UK context, how they feel resentful towards newcomers because of competition over resources like jobs and housing. But many new migrants actually settle into places which are already settled by previous migrants. And at least in the European contexts, we know very little about how these long-established migrants and ethnic minorities react to new immigration. Now, often these areas are disadvantaged as well. So my project wanted to look at what it is like for these long-established ethnic minorities to deal with newcomers and how their reactions towards newcomers are related to existing inequalities and potentially their own experiences of exclusion, especially in regards to racism and Islamophobia. Now, in Newham, Eastern European immigration has been the most noticeable. And this isn't just something that I found in regards to statistics, but also during my fieldwork. When I asked about changes in the area in regards to the population, every single person talked about Eastern Europeans. So this is very much something experienced as a noticeable change. So today I'll specifically be focusing on reactions towards Eastern European migrants. And I'll first introduce you a little bit to the borough of Newham and the research background. And then I'll focus on 2 emerging findings of the project. One relates to long-established ethnic minorities' experiences of racism and Islamophobia and how they deal with this in their everyday lives. And the second theme looks at how these experiences impact on their attitudes towards white Eastern European newcomers. Now, this second theme directly relates to economic precariousness, because the reactions towards newcomers are very much shaped by a sense of economic insecurity. Now, to make sense of all of this, I have found it really useful to draw on some sociological theories of conviviality and boundary making, and I'll talk a little bit about these 2. So to start, I'm going to take you straight to Newham. This is on Green Street in Newham, and as you can see, there's a large number of South Asian shops and businesses. And places like this could also be described as areas of ethnic minority predominance, where you have residential clusterings of ethnic minorities. And although some of the original immigrants to these areas and their children have moved away, many of them have made these neighborhoods their homes. Their presence is visibly marked, as you can see, by shops, restaurants, and services like taxi firms and religious institutions. And even if not dominating by actual numbers, these places are strongly identified with these specific groups in public discourse, in the eyes of the groups themselves, and by newcomers. And this is also on Green Street, and here you can see a Romanian shop. And this shop is right next to one of the many Asian shops which dominate the street. and this one was closed for prayer when I was there. Now, this example captures what is currently happening in many urban areas in Europe and beyond. It shows how new migrants often settle into areas which have already been settled by previous migrants. And as you all know, in North America, this has also been historically described as ethnic succession, but in Europe, it's a more recent phenomenon. Also in the US, ethnic succession often refers to how ethnic minorities settle in specific areas and then collectively move on to better areas while being replaced by new migrants. But in places like Newham, we don't have this bigger shift. So lots of the old migrant families who came in the 50s and 60s stayed. I have met a lot of members of the second generation who now have their own children, and they don't intend to move because of their kinship networks in the area. Areas with large numbers of ethnic minorities and newcomers have also been described as arrival areas. And in these places, you have so-called arrival infrastructures which support newcomers. Here are just a few pictures which exemplify such arrival infrastructures in Newham. And these range from English classes to immigration advice, money transfer agencies, as well as informally rented rooms, advertised, as you can see, in newcomers' own languages. So the project that I will talk about today looks at how long-established ethnic minorities react to this new immigration and how newcomers adapt to areas of ethnic minority predominance. And I'm particularly interested in finding out whether there are new forms of discrimination or exclusion, or in contrast, new forms of solidarity and conviviality. And I'm interested in how socio-economic conditions shape these processes. Today, as I said, I specifically focus on how long-term experiences of stigmatization among the long-established ethnic minorities impact on the reception of newcomers. And I will situate these processes within sociological and anthropological theories of conviviality. Now, I'm not going to go into these theories too much because I want to focus on my empirical findings, but just briefly, scholars working on conviviality are interested in looking at how people who live in demographically diverse contexts live together successfully. And they look at how people rub along despite potential for tensions resulting from cultural and religious differences. Now, there's been a recent surge in scholarship on conviviality, which forms part of an older and broader concern with the ongoing question of how communities or cultures or society or nations stick together. So these questions relate to issues around social cohesion. Now, I have found the convivialities approach fruitful when looking at my empirical material. Rather than only focusing on processes of exclusion and discrimination, a conviviality approach enables us to recognize people's capacity to live together peacefully and to examine what kinds of strategies they developed to do so. Now, of course, this includes recognizing the existence of discrimination and racism, but it also sheds light on people's skills to manage interactions across cultural, religious, linguistic, and class differences in everyday life. Now, just briefly, I want to talk a little bit about Newham. It lies in the east of London. And as I mentioned, it's a classical immigrant reception area where new arrivals find their feet and where relatively affordable rental housing can be found. It's also one of the most deprived areas in Britain, with high unemployment and a high rate of child poverty. And in fact, Newham performs worst or below London average across most indicators of deprivation, like employment rate, low incomes, economic inactivity, etc. Now, in contrast to other traditionally poor areas of London, Newham has only seen very little gentrification, and this gentrification is mainly concentrated in areas near the Olympic development built for the 2012 Olympics. In terms of ethnicity, the borough has the lowest proportion of white British people in England and Wales actually, and more than 42% of the population were born outside the UK. Now the area also has a very high population turnover rate. In 2015, 37% of the population had been in Newham for less than 5 years, and only 44% had been there for more than 10 years. So this shows that you've got ongoing movement, immigration, but also emigration. Now, only 39% of the population have English as their first language, and 2/3 of those with English as their second language live in poverty. So poverty is also very much related to immigration. Now, while the area could also be described as super diverse in regards to the number of nationalities, religions, legal statuses, and other such categories, the actual feel to the area is very different in comparison with other super diverse areas where you don't have majority groups. Many areas of Newham actually feel very South Asian, which you could also see on the pictures that I showed you earlier. And this Asian presence is particularly pronounced in certain areas, so certain pockets of the area, for example, on Green Street, which I showed you. Now, since the EU accession in 2004, that's when some Eastern European countries joined the European Union, Newham has seen the arrival of increasing numbers of Eastern Europeans, and in some areas of Newham, the numbers have now reached as much as 11% of the population. And the main countries of origin are Poland, Romania, and Lithuania. And here on the slide, they are represented as white other. Now, of course, both the long-established residents and the newcomers are diverse in themselves in terms of countries of origin, religions, educational backgrounds, etc. So there's diversity within these groups as well. In terms of methods, I'm a social anthropologist and the research is primarily qualitative. And as part of my fieldwork, I have attended various community groups like a weekly knitting group, a monthly coffee morning, both of these in libraries. I undertook in-depth interviews with local residents and newcomers. I did focus group interviews with different groups of residents like elderly groups, young people, mothers at a primary school, etc. I spoke to experts like teachers or sort of local, local experts like teachers and policemen and social workers. And of course, I had a lot of informal conversations with people working in cafes and shops. And so far, more than 100 individuals have participated in the research. Now, the knitting group has been the most interesting, and I attended it on a weekly basis for a year, and that was before COVID. So I did fieldwork for about a year before COVID. And you can see a picture here. There's the second picture, but that was when it was Eid, so we were eating rather than knitting. And another interesting group was the coffee morning, but actually I'm not going to talk about this. I am going to talk about it today. So this was a coffee morning once a month of a group of elderly people, some of whom went for walks before the coffee and then came to the library and sat together to chat. And these people are of both ethnic minority and white British backgrounds. But on this day, when the picture was taken, the white British weren't present. Now, in order to understand the long-established minorities' attitudes towards newcomers, we need to understand their own current situation in Newham and the UK more generally. In regards to their sense of inclusion and exclusion. And I'll first focus on racism and Islamophobia, and towards the end of my talk, I'll also talk about the impact of socio-economic disadvantage. Now, I spoke to different generations of ethnic minorities, and there was a general sense that racism had decreased over time. I heard many accounts of how terrible it was at the beginning when they first came, with children having bricks thrown at them in the 1970s. People had dog poo put in their letterboxes, etc. And this kind of everyday racism was reported to have very much decreased over time. And in fact, young people hardly reported any experiences of everyday racism. at least within the areas in Newham where they lived. However, they also talked about how differently they felt when they left the area and went to more white British areas of London. And even within Newham, there were certain no-go areas because they were perceived as too white and racist. Also, there were reports of continuous institutionalized racism, for example, in regards to finding jobs or policing. Now, while everyday racism on most of Newham's streets decreased, many Muslim research participants clearly felt that Islamophobia massively increased since 9/11. And I know that this is no news to any of us, but I still find it quite striking how strongly people talked about the difference of before and after 9/11. One of my research participants described how she grew up in the 70s when she did experience racism in the streets, but how things got better in the course of the 80s and especially in the 90s, and then things deteriorated again after 2001. Now, there's a large and sophisticated scholarship on racism, but what interests me here is people's everyday strategies of dealing with stigmatization and how this relates to the immigration of new white migrants. And here I'd like to draw on Greg Noble's work on what he describes as everyday labor of intercultural connection. Amanda Wise has used this idea in her work on convivial labor. And she describes how, and I quote, the everyday practice of living together takes work, end of quote. So it's about negotiating differences in everyday life, and this can be hard work. Now I want to build on this notion and develop it a bit further by showing different patterns of convivial labor which came up in my empirical material. Now in Newham, I found plenty of instances of what could be described as easy conviviality. So people getting along across differences and helping each other out in public space, for example, when getting on buses, etc. And some of these instances could also be described with the notion of civility, which refers to people behaving in a civil manner in public space, regardless of other people's looks or backgrounds. Now, convivial labor refers to more conscious efforts to get along, which go beyond civility. And one of my research participants simply said, we have to get along. And this pointed to the fact that it can't be taken for granted and it takes some work. And an example of this is food sharing or forms of neighborly reciprocity. So, for example, an East African Indian woman who came here in the 70s talked about how she was looking for a Chinese New Year card for her Chinese neighbors. And she did so because in previous years, her Chinese neighbors had always brought over some food for the occasion. Now, in addition to these proactive patterns of convivial labor, I have also found other patterns which specifically relate to experiences of exclusion. And these involve specific actions which should contribute to good relations or prevent negative relations from, or prevent negative actions. And they are formed in response to experiences of Islamophobia or racism. So for example, especially among Muslim women, I have found specific efforts to maintain and create peaceful relations with people who might have negative views about Muslims, as well as with people more generally. One of my female British Muslim research participants, for example, she said in a focus group that she always tries to be extremely helpful with other people in public space. For example, she offered an elderly lady to carry her shopping bags, and she always smiles at people. And she said that we are portraying that we are not like that, whatever image the elderly lady has in her head. She also said that she finds that we have to make that effort more because we are Muslims and we've got scars. Another woman in a different focus group also talked about how we have to prove ourselves. Now, Kay, a British Muslim woman born and bred in Newham, she told me the following episode, which really captures these strategies of maintaining peaceful relations. And it also shows how this can be hard work in the face of racism. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with East London, a Cockney accent, which she talks about, is the local East London English accent or dialect. So she said, you know, car boot sales, the best ones are on farms, like Essex have a lot of them, and I love going there. So when we went up to these, I would make sure I wore a light-coloured headscarf, because I found that when I wore all black, the English were very hostile there. That's where I was going to encounter a lot of English from a close community, if you like. We used to call it my Essex hijab because it was white. So I'd go in my Essex hijab just to lighten the mood a little bit. When they could see I could speak English with a Cockney accent, that was their first shock. I once got in the way of someone with my trolley, and the guy said something like, "Oh, run me over, won't you?" And so I turn around very politely and say, "Oh, did I nearly knock you out there? I'm really sorry." He was just taken aback. "No, love, that's okay, no worries, you carry on." And I turned around and thought, you thought I didn't speak English. And then when I come through with a Cockney accent, it's a different story. Now, while Kay was being very active with her reaction, there are also less active forms of convivial labour with which people react to racism and Islamophobia. So, for example, at one of the coffee mornings at the library, which I showed you a picture of, there were about 4 born and bred white British residents in their 70s. And there were also about eight ethnic minority residents of South Asian and Caribbean backgrounds. And when I asked about changes in the area, the white British openly talked about how there were now too many Muslims in the area, that they had taken over, that it's the League of Nations now, etc. Now, none of the other coffee drinkers reacted, which very much surprised me. And the woman running the group, so the social worker, she was of South Asian background, and the white British people knew her very well. They were very friendly with her. They congratulated her to her wedding with big hugs, etc. But at the same time, they made these really racist remarks right in front of her. Now, I found out later that she felt very uncomfortable about this, but she didn't want to say anything to avoid tensions. The next coffee morning was run by a social worker of African origin, and again, one of the white British people made rather controversial remarks about the British Empire and how the Brits brought the railways to the colonies and built up these places. And none of the ethnic minority coffee drinkers said anything, and neither did the social worker. Now, when I asked him later how he copes with these kinds of situations, he told me that he did not want to alienate the white British and cause more tensions within the group. A Caribbean woman who was present at that coffee morning told me later that she's used to this. She has worked as a nurse for many years, and she said that she has often experienced this kind of racism within her work. And she felt like it was pointless to react to such racist remarks. So by staying quiet and not addressing the issue, she and the other members of the coffee morning quietly contributed to the conviviality of the group. Now, I know this is not easy conviviality, but it's laborious and it leaves a rather bitter aftertaste. Michelle Lamont and her colleagues identify this kind of reaction to stigmatization as not responding, because a response is perceived as pointless and there is little hope for change by responding. It could also be described as aspirational conviviality, because it demonstrates how people are keen to prevent relationships from breaking down, even in the face of the extremely disrespectful behavior of the white British coffee drinkers. And with this notion of aspirational conviviality, I now want to turn to attitudes towards Eastern Europeans. Now, as I mentioned, when asking long-established residents about changes in the area, all of them first mentioned the number of Eastern Europeans moving in. So it's definitely something very much experienced as a rapid change. And just to exemplify this, a school teacher told me how a few years back, her school was predominantly ethnic minority, with up to 90% of children of Asian, Caribbean, and African backgrounds. And now the school is about 50% white due to Eastern European immigration. Aspirational conviviality was expressed in a focus group with ethnic minority mothers at this school, and they expressed the wish for more opportunities to meet parents at the school who are from other places like Eastern Europe and with whom they don't have much opportunity to interact. They criticized Eastern Europeans for not wanting to mix, for example, at the school gates or on playgrounds. Now, in an earlier study, I have conceptualized this expectation that people should mix across ethnic and religious differences as ethos of mixing. Ethnic minority residents express this ethos of mixing through expectations that newcomers should speak English. And one of the main complaints about Eastern Europeans was that they spoke their own languages in public space or at the workplace, and that they did not make enough effort to speak English when out and about. They contrasted this with their own histories of immigration, emphasizing that their parents always encouraged them to speak English in public space, even if they themselves didn't speak English. Now, I found this interesting because the criticism that newcomers don't want to mix is exactly what many British Muslims are criticized for, both in public and policy discourse. Another sentiment about Eastern Europeans is related to how people feel about groups of Eastern Europeans hanging out in public space. And this is directly related to notions of civility and order. One of the repeated criticisms that came up was that they drink in public space, which is something that especially Muslim residents find difficult to accept. And also there was much criticism of increased begging on the streets, which was ascribed to Romanians. Now, both drinking and begging clearly break rules of civility and conviviality in the views of these research participants. Now, these issues around civility and order have been observed in many other contexts of insider-outsider constellations in neighborhoods across Europe and beyond. So, for example, Andreas Wimmer observed it in relation to Swiss cities in the early 2000s, and Sandra Wallman observed it in South London already in the 1980s. Oh, sorry, I needed to check where I was. Now, civility and order are among the main issues of contention in contexts characterized by rapid population changes. However, resentment against newcomers is also related to socio-economic conditions and competition over resources. And I now have a rather long quote, but it really captures these feelings. And the quote is taken from a focus group with mothers of ethnic minority background at a primary school in Newham, and all of them are British Muslims, except for Sharon, who is of Caribbean background. And the quote is quite long and it's 2 slides, and I think I'm going to let you read it unless somebody objects, because it's several voices and it's probably easier if you read it individually. Is that okay? If I don't see objections, I assume it's okay. Okay, I hope it's okay if I continue. Just to clarify, Tesco is a huge supermarket chain in the UK, and that's where Sharon works. So this discussion illustrates the mixed feelings these women have about the newcomers. Importantly, the negative views about newcomers have to be placed in the context of precariousness. So these women are worried about the future of their children. Sharon, for example, the mother who works at Tesco's, she's a mom of 3 sons and 1 daughter, and she's worried about her children's future as well as their safety when out and about in public space. Now, there's been an increase in knife crime in the area, and because of cuts in services, some of the youth centres and services have shut down. A lot of the discussion in the focus group was around lack of opportunities for their children and how they don't know where to go during their spare time. Sharon feels that her and her children's lives are characterized by increased insecurity. And this precariousness is also shaped by the fear of losing her job in a large supermarket because of increased competition. Now, despite this resentment about newcomers and the view that the newcomers have it easier because of the color of their skin, the discussion also shows empathy towards the newcomers and how histories of migration and the struggles of their parents' settlement have not been forgotten. Now, while their views kind of wavered between empathy and resentment, the mothers, as well as other research participants, described interactions on the ground as similarly nuanced. So when it comes to social practices of conviviality rather than attitudes, things are different. So for example, the women talked about how if their children make friends with Eastern European children, they do sometimes meet the Eastern European mothers on the playground and they smile at each other. And other research participants talked about neighborly relations with Eastern Europeans and, for example, how their neighbors would share a barbecue with them or how they told them to take their washing in because they were having a barbecue. One of my research participants who said negative things about Eastern European drinkers in the park later said that actually they sometimes also pat her dog and say hello, and that therefore she wouldn't shun them. Now, to analyze these findings, I have found Andreas Wimmer's work on boundary making really useful. Drawing on earlier work on boundary making, he talks about how the dominated sometimes strategically and successfully adopt cultural boundary markers in order to disidentify with other minorities or with their own ethnic category and gain acceptance by the majority. And this is exactly what the women in the focus group did when emphasizing that their own parents always spoke English in public space, in contrast to Eastern Europeans who speak their own languages. So I hope to have presented to you a nuanced picture of the workings of conviviality and stereotypes in this context of ongoing immigration. And all in all, ongoing racism, Islamophobia and disadvantage are much bigger issues in the lives of ethnic minorities in Newham than new immigration. New immigration is generally only seen as a problem when it comes to issues around civility and order in public space and competition over resources like housing and jobs. Now, of course, these issues they also feed into stereotypes about the increase of unknown white newcomers who get jobs more easily, drink on the street, and leave rubbish on the street. And these stereotypes are further exacerbated by the media. But these stereotypes coexist with empathetic views of the hardship of more recent arrivals, as well as more positive social relations. And these empathetic views have also been expressed in relation to Brexit, to the UK leaving the EU, much of which was motivated by voters who wanted to stop Eastern European immigration. And as a result of Brexit, there was a lot of discrimination and sort of racism against Eastern Europeans. Now, importantly, conviviality, which goes beyond civility in public space, takes effort. And this is the case in regards to relations with everybody living in the area, as well as with more recently settled migrants. Now, I've shown that there are different forms of convivial labor in reaction to racism. So while some specifically attempt to deflate racism by showing kindness in public space and trying to make a good impression. Others put in convivial labor by ignoring racist remarks, and both strategies are hard work. Now, I guess this kind of convivial labor could also be applied to other categories like gender and sexuality. So, for example, when women ignore patronizing or sexist remarks. Now, I have also found what could be described as aspirational conviviality. And with this, I refer to the wish to get along with people perceived as different and the hope for more opportunities to meet across differences. Aspirational conviviality also comes to the fore when people talk about others who allegedly don't want to mix. Now, importantly, aspirational conviviality does not mean that people expect newcomers to assimilate, but it relates to these everyday interactions in public and semi-public spaces like playgrounds or school gates. And just to end, the effort convivial relations take was acknowledged by a group of teenage boys in a secondary school who, in a focus group, talked about how the school organized various activities to mix up the school children and get them out of their groups. And these groups were mostly defined by language and ethnicity. And the school also wanted to mix the kids a bit more to give those children who don't have English as their mother tongue a chance to learn more English. And when I asked these youngsters what happened after these events during the lunch breaks, they laughingly said that they then split up into their own groups again. Now, they didn't really see this as a problem, and all of them were perfectly happy to engage in convivial labor with the other students. But when it came to chilling out with their friends, they took it for granted that they'd be with those to whom they felt linguistically and culturally most similar. Now, of course, their views need to be put into perspective. So they did not feel like Sharon, the Black British mother I mentioned earlier. These youngsters felt that they were on a path of upward mobility. They were very happy with their school, and they also felt that Newham provided young people with opportunities. However, they have not yet been exposed to the structural racism that exists within the British job market. Now, in my continuing fieldwork, I'll have to pay close attention to examples like Sharon's, who finds it very difficult to reconcile her socio-economic marginalization with accepting the arrival of supposedly more successful newcomers who, according to her, and I quote, don't even speak English, but get the jobs because they are white. And I'll end here. Thank you very much for listening.